Get ready for more interruptions.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We're ready to begin. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyid al-Mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqtadun min lisani yafqahu qawli. Assalamu alaikum, jazakumullah khair, and thank you for joining us this evening for tonight's webinar entitled Search in Search of Sacred Justice, Navigating the Pathway from Oppression to Mutual Healing. We're here tonight to discuss how people of faith can respond to and heal from the long legacy of white supremacy and racial terror that's been plaguing our country for generations. My name is Zainab Chaudry. I'm the director of CAIR's office here in Maryland, and I'm so pleased to introduce our lead moderator for tonight's discussion, my dear friend, mentor, sister, Candace Islaah Abdl'Rahim. Ustadha Islaah is the founder and co-director of Baltimore Area Muslims, a group that aims to develop, support, and strengthen the Muslim community in the greater Baltimore area. Her work in Islamic and secular education has been informed by her belief that it is her moral duty to seek the truth and propagate it using the written and spoken word to aid in liberating, educating, and healing. She formerly served as an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins University Graduate School of Education with a focus on human development, learning diversity, and culturally responsive education. She holds a master's degree in teaching and a certificate of advanced studies in educational supervision and administration. Ustadha Islaah, Jazakallah khair, thank you so much for serving as tonight's co-moderator.
Alhamdulillah, Sister Zaynab. And after praising Allah Azza wa Jal and sending salams upon his messenger, I'd like to thank you and the CAIR Maryland organization for selecting me, excuse me, to co-moderate this program tonight. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to discuss a few important topics related to current events. Tonight is the death of Ahmaud Arbery, that brings us together. But since the planning of this program, more killings have taken place. So tonight could easily be about any of those people. It could be about, for example, 26-year-old Breonna Taylor, who was shot 8 times and killed in a botched police raid. Tonight could be about many of the other victims of violence, but we're going to stay with our original plan and focus a little bit more on the Arbery case. As most of you are aware, on February 28th, 2020, a 25-year-old Black man named Ahmaud Arbery went for a jog in a residential neighborhood in Georgia. 2 white men, Gregory McMichael, 64, and his 34-year-old son, Travis, followed him in their truck, pursued him, and then shot him to death. They admitted to the shooting. That shooting was caught on video. Last week, over 2 months later, the 2 men were arrested and charged in Arbery's murder after immense public pressure from the video of the incident went viral on social media. The McMichaels stated that they followed Arbery because they suspected him to be connected to some burglaries that had recently occurred. But according to the police official reports, the area had had 0 reports of burglaries over the months prior to the murder. The father-son duo decided to be judge, jury, and executioner of Mr. Arbery and killed who appears to be an innocent Black man who was merely out for a jog.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Islaah. And at the center of this story, the fact that there's another family here in America that's been changed forever. We want to pause and acknowledge and extend our sincere condolences to Ahmaud's mother, Wanda Cooper Jones. Ahmaud was born, as many people know, on Mother's Day in 1994. And this past Sunday, as families across the country marked Mother's Day in quarantine, we can only imagine how difficult this ordeal has been for her and so many other mothers who've endured similar injustices, having to bury their children too soon. They are in our prayers, and we continue to make a dua for them that Allah heals them inshallah, and rids this this scourge from our nation, inshallah. The fact that this incident happened at all is extremely tragic and unjust, but the fact that scenes like this continue to play out repeatedly across America and have been for centuries, it's undeniably traumatizing and oppressive to directly impacted communities. It also affects those of us who recognize the devastating impact of structural racism and white supremacy here in our society, and who acknowledge that we also have a role to play in dismantling these structures that continue to perpetuate these injustices. So we're going to delve deeper into this conversation, inshallah, in the next hour, and explore how our communities can lean on our faith to move towards justice and healing, inshallah. And to help us navigate this conversation, we are so blessed to have here with us Imam Dawud, Walid, and Brother Tariq Toure.
Alhamdulillah. So I want to introduce our first panelist, Tariq Toure. He is an award-winning poet from West Baltimore, Alhamdulillah. And his work has been featured in numerous publications, including Muslim Matters, Salon, The Washington Post, Al Jazeera, Sapelo Square, Nation, and the LA Times. His debut collection of poetry, Black Seeds, won Best Poetry Book of Baltimore, and it was awarded by City Paper, the City Paper. He has been featured as a lecturer, performer, and an artist at Howard, Princeton, Georgetown, and other universities, alhamdulillah. He's the author also of a book entitled Two Parts Oxygen, which is a collection exploring faith, family, and fatherhood. And I must add, for the sake of transparency, that Tariq is my blessing stepson, alhamdulillah. So we welcome Brother Tariq.
Our next panelist is no stranger to all of us. We're blessed to also have Ustadha Zainab Ansari here with us. Assalamu alaikum, Ustadha. Jazakallah khair for taking time out of your schedule this Ramadan to be part of this critical conversation. As many of you may know, she is a faculty member, a resident scholar, and board member at the CAIR Seminary. She has previously written and taught for Sunni Path and served as a freelance writer for Aziza magazine. She's also served as a coordinator of oral histories for the After Malcolm Project, a digital archive of African American Muslim history.
Assalamu alaikum. Alhamdulillah. And the third panelist, excuse me, is Imam Dawud Walid. Imam Dawud is the executive director of the Michigan chapter of the Council of American Islamic Relationships, also known as CAIR. CAIR is America's largest Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization. He is also a member of the Michigan Muslim Community Council, MMCC, and the Imams Committee of that council. Alhamdulillah, and he has been interviewed and quoted in numerous media outlets, including the New York Times, NPR, BBC, and Al Jazeera. Alhamdulillah.
So we're grateful and honored to have all of our panelists here with us. Jazakumullah khair again for taking the time out of your Ramadan to be with us to help find a path forward in all of this darkness. We don't have a lot of time, and we have a lot of questions that we want to, inshallah, get to. So we will delve right in. And the first question that Ustadha Islaah and I wanted to just kind of like put out there and kind of get your thoughts on specifically is that we've been hearing a lot of voices on social media and our private networks through our friends circles of people who say that they feel tired, disillusioned, angry, even numb at the news of Ahmad's murder. And our first question for you is, what was your initial reaction when you learned about this case? And we're not going to show the video here tonight, but what is your advice for anyone who hasn't decided whether or not they want to watch it?
Either of you can jump in.
Assalamu alaikum. I had to unmute myself. Well, I think, you know, unfortunately, you grow accustomed to these sorts of acts of violence happening here. It's just sort of just a fact of life here right now under these conditions. And when I heard about his murder, number one, I wasn't trying to see it, but of course, you know, with the internet, it's very difficult. Like videos play, and I think at times you have in the back of your head this sort of feeling like maybe at whatever second they say this is supposed to happen, that it's not going to happen, and then it happens. And you know, one of the things, you know, I try not to shy away from being able to feel these things. And so for people who haven't seen or have seen it, you know, dealing with it, I would say, you know, if you're not prepared to ingest violence like that, you don't have to. You watching it isn't going to make it any more realer, if that makes sense. You watching it isn't going to, you know, take away from the truth of what happened. And ultimately, everybody deals with ingesting these things differently. And if you're somebody who is going to be harboring grief and it's going to have some inward and outward effects, I would say stay away. Stay as far as possible away from it. That doesn't mean that you're not valuable in providing a voice or providing support. It just means that the heaviness of the situation is something that you can't reckon with on your own. And so that's what I would say.
Would anyone else like to respond?
Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. I'd like to begin in the name of Allah Ta'ala, most gracious, most merciful, and invoking Allah Ta'ala's peace and blessings upon Prophet Muhammad and his family and companions, Ameen, and thanking the organizers of this event, and expressing my deepest condolences to the family of Ahmaud Arbery. And you know, regarding the question that was asked, posed by our distinguished moderator, this is a very difficult question, because the problem with these videos is that it shouldn't have taken capturing this film to you know, to sort of motivate people to feel that sense of outrage at what happened. That it actually took this film evidence for many people to actually realize that an injustice had occurred. So I'm very conflicted about it. And I'm also conflicted about it because the person that, from what I understand, the person that captured the video was not doing this in an attempt to make sure that that Ahmaud Arbery would receive justice. They were actually, I think, from what I understand, capturing the video in an effort to basically establish this allegation of criminality. So I'm very conflicted about it, because it's not that this person made this video in an effort to help or come to his aid, not at all. But the video exists. I viewed the video, but when I looked at it, my reaction was just utter dismay that the killing of this innocent person has been captured on a video that anybody can watch, you know, for any purpose. And I think that it does lend to people becoming desensitized to this kind of violence, and that every human being deserves dignity and deserves to have a dignified ending. And so for the ending of Ahmaud Arbery's life to be captured in this way, where anybody can view it, this is something that I think has me very conflicted, because ultimately I want us to care, but I don't know that having this video out there makes people care more or be more concerned, and Allah knows best.
Alhamdulillah. Okay, Imam Dawud, would you like to respond, or would you like the next question?
Oh, we can move on to the next question. I don't have anything else to add further.
Okay. All right. So historically, justice has been denied or delayed for Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities in America and really abroad. Can you realistically and honestly, at this point in your life, say that you can visualize American society changing to the extent that this is no longer the norm? And what do you think would be the catalyst for such a change?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathiran da'iman abada. So first of all, let me thank the people who put this together, Sister Zainab, Ustadha, who was also moderating, alhamdulillah, and also to our two honorable co-panelists. And may Allah Azza wa Jal bless all of you who are watching, and may Allah Azza wa Jal accept all of your loved ones who have passed of COVID-19 as shuhada, and may He grant shifa for all of your loved ones who are sick. I'm in a difficult space right now because one of our beloved imams, Imam Salim Joseph, was buried today, and I watched his janazah over Facebook. He's one of the pioneers of the Detroit Muslim community. So let me first say that in that question, to those who are watching, and I know you all know this, it's a reminder to you as well as myself that perfect justice is only in akhirah. So this is number one. So we have to always remember that perfect justice in akhirah, and doesn't mean we don't strive for justice in this life, and we should, and we are commanded so much in the Quran to be just, bothly in spreading justice and standing up for justice, and even being just in our own personal affairs, as Allah says, He commands us be just, and being just is what's closest to taqwa. So have taqwa for Allah. So obviously this is our goal, is to see a more just society. But these killings that we see, such as Mr. Ahmed Arbery and so many others, these are really as American as cherry pie. And what I'd like for the audience to think about that are watching, stop saying that the system is broken. When we see these things and people get acquitted and they say, oh, well, the system's broken, the system's broken. No, the system is working exactly how it was designed to operate, right? So we need to change our mindsets and our language of how we even view these things, that we just have smartphones and cameras to see some of these things, but this same discussion about these same things, when I was a teenager, I know a guy who's a teenager that got shot and killed in Richmond, Virginia, where I grew up at, and got killed, and the people got acquitted. And the same conversations my father had growing up in the 60s, and his father had, like my grandfather and my great-grandfather. This is an old conversation, right? So, and then also we're talking about, we're talking about 400 years of dehumanization of Black people in America, right? And all of the trauma that Black people have taken on that's been passed down, and then also white people in general being victims of this, and that many of them have either a false sense of superiority, or they've been instilled to have fear, because this is fear that if Black people or people of color get on top, that we're going to do to them what they've done systemically and historically to us, right? So this is a very deep and complex thing. I try to be an optimist, and I said that we have to work to change things, but if I've learned anything from my teachers and about the issues of suluk, is that these broader societal changes cannot be legislated nor adjudicated away, because we're talking about spiritual diseases, right? And spiritual diseases have to be treated, right? Like jahl has to be treated, ignorance, like we're talking about khawf has to be dealt with. We have to talk about huzn, or grief, has to be dealt with, right? And then this will help bring about over time shifting culture, because we have 400 years of embedded culture. We have to treat hearts and to change minds, to shift culture, because we can't legislate nor adjudicate away anti-Black racism. Like, no set of laws and no amount of court cases is going to do away with hate. And that same thing goes for Islamophobia, by the way. We can't sue away Islamophobia, right? We can't sue away, we can't have court cases or have certain laws and in racial profiling act or whatever, and that's just going to do away. Those are really treating symptoms, but the real disease is inside the hearts and minds of the people, and that informs the culture. And Allah knows best.
Alhamdulillah. Would anybody like to add on?
Yes, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I just wanted to begin by saying that I had the pleasure of meeting Sister Islaah
Yes.
in Baltimore. It was I think a few months ago. It's amazing how time flies by. But I just wanted to respond to what Imam Dawud was saying regarding racism, because I think part of the struggle here is trying to understand what is the logic behind this. Is there a logic? Is there a logic behind racism? One of the things that we've heard for a long time, especially say if you're reading, historical works on the subject, sociologists and even economists and others will talk about this idea that there's actually a logic, animating racism in terms of this fear that many whites have, especially Southern whites, in terms of trying to kind of keep African Americans, Black people in their place. And that there's this kind of like fear of competition and what have you. But ultimately, I do agree with Imam Dawud in the sense that as Muslims, we have to understand that the sort of this original fear and loathing and hatred of the other, it manifested itself with Shaitan in the very beginning of creation, right? So I think it is important that we understand it from a theological and a Quranic standpoint, obviously with that empowering us to pose solutions from within our tradition, but ultimately it really is about people being able to address what is in their hearts. And that was my first response when I saw that appalling video, that what sort of hatred must exist in the hearts of the people that did this, that committed this crime, that they would view another human being as a legitimate target for basically being hunted down and killed, right? Again, whatever sort of historical context might exist and whatever economic explanations we can bring to bear, and whatever we can actually examine of the history of South Georgia, also being able to address, I think, very openly the pathology that exists in the hearts of people who do these kinds of things.
Alhamdulillah. The trauma that's been inflicted by these injustices can have lasting consequences for the victims in society as a whole, okay? We talk about PTSD. That trauma can affect a person's outlook on life, their self-image, their belief about their trajectory for their lives. So I want to ask you, what do you do with that pain? Okay, so we mentioned at the onset that we didn't show the video, and we knew that I haven't seen the video. And I'm also a poet, and I have a poem that deals with, I can't do another. I can't do any more hashtags. I'm tired. Okay, as the mother of sons, I'm tired. So what do you do with the trauma and pain? And what techniques have you personally found for coping and processing? And Tariq, I'd like you to also speak to how you use your art to do this.
Alhamdulillah. So, number one, I just, as you said in the introduction, growing up in West Baltimore, you experience and you ingest and you encounter yourself and your counterparts that are living there, young Black men who have been going through grief-filling situations since you was, 5 years old, 6 years old, from what you've seen, from what's been acted upon you. And in not dealing with that and not dealing with trauma, the people who are nearest to you end up getting the brunt of whatever comes out of you. It's sort of like a bunch of broken bottles being in a box. They're going to cut each other, the glass is going to cut each other. And so the first thing that I would say as Muslims, just number one, is to just turn to Allah. And I think the responsibility of artists is to reflect light upon the truth. Reflect Allah's light upon the truth. And one of the things that always grounds me is the ayah in Surah Zilzala, when Allah says that, whoever doesn't add to the weight of evil, they're going to see it. So we were speaking about justice. So people will see what they've put forth. And then our job is to make that reality known through our work, through our expression to other people. I think the other part of just being able to deal with trauma and grief is being able to accept that you've seen too much, you've experienced too much. And myself, a lot of my peers, we were not very accepting of that when we was younger. And so that context sort of gives you some really poor coping mechanisms to walk throughout the world with. And exhibits itself in just, neighborhood violence, and exhibits itself where you're in other contexts where people really don't adhere to the same sort of code that you were once living in. And you really have to like reverse a lot of thinking. So, as now, a college educated person, someone who grew up in the madrasa and is now still trying to peel some layers off, I'm still, it's still all there. I find myself sitting and reflecting and trying to pray as much as possible, to make dhikr as much as possible, so I can just start to chip away and remove some of those poisons. And I guess the other thing on the flip side is that one of the social contracts, I guess people would say, of our counterparts, here in this country, white people, so to say, is indifference. So there have been a class of people who've acted out the violence, and there's been a class of people who've had to like look the other way. And so if you look the other way for a long time, you begin to build a narrative in your head that maybe what's happening isn't that bad. And so you're carrying a different type of grief and trauma. And that just puts a complete veil over your eyes. And it's a pharaonic veil, because there were normal people in the time of Pharaoh who maybe wasn't going out and doing all the crazy stuff to people. So that's what I've tried to do with that.
Would anyone else like to respond?
Yeah, I'd like to respond. Just try to be very brief. I think that there's a couple of aspects, emotional as well as intellectual. And this is specific for Muslims who are Black, and in particular, the descendants of the enslaved Africans, that we have to be in spaces of healing, right? And sometimes that means getting out of the country strategically for periods of time if we're able to afford it. And then also the sohbah that we have, where we're able to talk with people and be in safe spaces where we can have certain discussions, including around other Muslims. And I would say to my Muslim brothers and sisters who aren't Black, that don't view this as something like qawmiya or shu'ubiyya, like as some sort of nationalism, that when you're Black and you live in the United States of America, and the daily pressure that you live under and sometimes don't even know about it. I mean, I had to go to West Africa in my time in West Africa and sitting with the mashayikh and getting away, where I really, for the first time I felt free in my life, was actually being in Mali, really, where I didn't feel this overwhelming sense of like having to worry about police or about how people are looking at me as different, or like I have to change my behavior to make white folks feel comfortable in the elevator or walking through a store or down the street. Like the first time I felt free actually was in Africa, right? So, I mean, my point is saying that we have to heal from this, because we are re-traumatized every day, and sometimes we don't know it. The second thing is, for those of you who like to read, and he wrote about this from different theological angles about a decade ago. My beloved mentor, Dr. Sherman Abdul-Hakim Jackson, wrote the book, Islam and the Problem of Black Suffering. And if you can take the time for a slow read, I would suggest reading that book. And you have to keep your dictionary close by to you, by the way, because it's not an easy read. It's a slow read, but I would suggest that book.
Ustadha, Zainab, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, that it's important within our Muslim community that we foster um, spaces that are spaces that are that allow African American Muslims, especially because I'm thinking more in terms of the interaction within the community and the experience of African American Muslims and dealing with anti-Black racism. You know, for me personally, I've had to deal with far more Islamophobia than anti-Black racism. But having said that, I have my mother's African American and my children are African American. So I do find myself sometimes looking within Muslim spaces to see if we are truly providing those spaces that offer comfort, support, solace, and the ability for African American Muslims to vocalize that this trauma exists for this community. Because I think too often we think of trauma in terms of what other groups have experienced. So we're of course willing and open, and of course we should, you know, have conversations about the trauma faced by Muslims in other parts of the world, whether it's Syria or Palestine or Kashmir or any number of places where people are suffering. But I think it's also important that we because I think there's a certain amount of stoicism that we expect of African American Muslims. I've encountered that over the years, this expectation that people be strong and be stoic and not complain and not kind of give voice to that pain. And I think it's time to let people to actually be able to give voice to that pain, because again, going back to the video, my first response was how painful and just how exhausting this is to watch yet another video of an innocent African American man being gunned down, and how we need to be able to connect this experience to the experience of people who've come into Islam as African Americans, looking for solace, looking for egalitarianism, looking for reassurance, and often not finding that support in Muslim spaces. So I'd like to talk more about that, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair for that insightful response. That's powerful conversation, subhanAllah. Our next question we want to talk a little bit about, according to a well-known hadith, Prophet Muhammad said that if we see a wrong, we must speak out against it, or we must act against it. If we can't act against it, we must speak out against it. If we can't speak out against it, we must dislike it in our heart, and that is the weakest of faith. So our question is, based on your perception and your experiences within the community, do you think that our communities are being selectively silent on different forms of oppression in our country? And what more do you feel needs to be done to address these systemic issues that are plaguing our communities, especially in the in the context of this current situation, the murder of our brother Ahmaud Arbery? And what kind of changes would you like to see happen from within?
Inshallah, if I may begin, I want to hear from Brother Tariq and Imam Dawud, but I want to, I think the way we think about our very presence as Muslims in this country, it needs to be realigned. I mean, often there's a very, especially amongst transnational Muslims or some transnational Muslims, and I'm the daughter of immigrants on my dad's side, so I can say this. There's a narrative of we came to this country and pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps. And I think that if we, whether it is newly arrived immigrants or people who've been here for a while, to be able to reframe that way of thinking, that our presence in this country and our achievements really were only possible because of the sacrifices made by African Americans and the civil rights movement and the larger movement of Black liberation, in which Muslims played a very important role. I think really being able to understand that the comfort that so many Muslims enjoy is because of those sacrifices. I'd like to begin with that point.
That actually makes me reflect, Ustadha Zainab. A couple years ago, I was having a conversation with a mosque leader in Baltimore, and not to deviate from the question, but he made a very valid point. He himself was an immigrant who had arrived to the United States in the 70s, and he shared his story of when he arrived to Maryland. He came to Baltimore, and he didn't know anything about where to go, even for groceries. And it was actually the African American brothers and sisters in Baltimore who basically held his hand and showed him, how to adjust and integrate into society. And subhanAllah, that debt that he was talking about that we owe to African American communities across the country is something that I think is not stated enough within these spaces. Imam Dawud, did you have any thoughts about this particular question? I know you probably have a lot to share about this, inshallah. I've heard you talk about this topic before.
Yeah, I'd really like to prefer to hear what Brother Tariq has to say, actually. But just very briefly, and I agree wholeheartedly with what Ustadha Zainab said, may Allah preserve her. We do need to do some realignment, even in terms of what we deem to be Islamic or Islamic causes. I think that intellectually seems to be a problem too, because Rohingya Muslims, that's Islamic. Kashmir is Islamic. Palestine is Islamic. But with Ahmadou Diallo, who was a Muslim who was murdered by NYPD, Imam Siraj at his Salatul Janazah, I remember very clearly, right? Oh, no, that was not, well, he was black, but that really wasn't Islamic, And that's part of the reason why I co-authored those two books centering Black narrative that relating to these issues, because this whole otherizing of Blackness in the consciousness of Muslims is a very big problem. I mean, just to even otherize Muslims who are Black, much less the broader Black community, right? So it's a couple of layers. I'd like to hear what Brother Tariq says, but a lot of this too goes back to what Ustadha Zainab says about the anti-Blackness or intra-Muslim racism affects and really blurs our vision about how we view anti-Blackness in the broader society, because it exists within our own community, right? And then it's a problem. But Bismillah, Brother Tariq, tafadhal.
So what I think is dangerous for our psyche, and what I think is dangerous for our psychological health, is if we sit and we hold our breath and we wait and we hope and we wait on our hands for people to walk across the room and say, you know what, I finally value you. I don't know what was going on with me, but today I finally get it. I finally get it. And so alhamdulillah, like if you do, but one thing I've kept saying, a lot is just like, no, ain't nobody coming to save us. And so that's something that Black Muslims have to understand, and that has to be a pillar of engendering some sort of self-worth, and not in a disrespectful way, like, hey, you're not coming to save us because of whatever your reasoning is. It's just that we have to really re-energize ourselves with a sense of due for self, a due for self-esteem, due for self-empowerment, and all of the any other words you can put to it, or institution, or you could put to it, because we got a lot of love. Black folks got a lot of love. Like you were saying, the brother, he came, he didn't know anything and stuff like that, and they went ahead and took care of him, make sure he found somewhere to eat. And maybe they might say something about, I've sort of turned that notch down. And in place of that, I say, who are the folks that have already reached out, who have already extended themselves, and who within our own group can we pour more love into? Because we need to be full people by the time whoever comes across the bridge to come meet us and try to do that. And so I think that needs to happen. So I was happy to see Mana come back aboard a couple weeks ago, because you really need those spaces. I was happy to see Lampposts do what they did last year and the year before. and all the rest of the coalitions that the people are doing, because you have to dig into self. You have to cultivate your own soil. And nobody is going to do that. Nobody historically is going to do that unless, you know, you're the Ansar. And so that's a high pedestal that we're asking people to aspire and ascribe to.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you.
I believe that Islam, of course, our faith, should be a liberating force in our lives. And Ustadha, Zainab, you spoke about how people looked upon Blacks came into the deen with the hope that this would be something that would be liberating and freeing. And over the years, over the decades, it's been, for me, 4+. It's become increasingly hard to believe that. I know the teachings are there. I know Islam teaches it, but in terms of the actual day-to-day practice that we see, what I find is very, very similar to what Brother Tariq has said. When you hear that dua that is inclusive of everyone's struggle but your own, and I liken it to being stifled, feeling when I express all of the parts of who I am, that somehow I am being nationalistic, I am being very pro-Black, Afrocentric. If I wear even African-inspired clothing that follows all of the rules of covering and hijab, then it is, well, you have somehow stepped into the realm of being pro something other than Muslim. But I watch as my brothers and sisters from Philistine and other places proudly display their garb or talk about their heritage. So we feel robbed at times. And so the one part of this title was dealing with mutual healing. For people who are trying to heal from this, what do you suggest for them? Because it is easy for us to start to look at the people, start to look at the places, like you mentioned, the safe spaces that are necessary. But of course, the ideal would be for us to be together. That's the ideal. But how do we heal from that? And not just the people who are the victims, the people who are inflicting this upon others and may not even be aware.
Thank you so much, Sister Islaah. You know, this is, subhanAllah, that's a very profound question. Regarding what I think the term is when we have sort of this this bias, right? You know, here's the thing. I think it's going to be it's difficult. It's going to be difficult. It's a conversation that we have to have within our community, but it's going to be difficult, I think, for people to even kind of arrive at a space of acknowledging that we actually hold these biases, right? We actually have that anti-Black racism actually exists in the Muslim community. I think the problem is that you will get people even until this day who will probably swear up and down they have no issue with this, and you know, they'll kind of give you the rhetoric of all Muslims kind of being brothers and sisters, et cetera, et cetera. So because again, I think it's very easy to kind of pay lip service to that. But when you kind of look at it on the level of, say, how much time do we actually spend very intentionally as a community of people outside of our own kind of ethnic group? Are we willing to consider marriage across those lines? I think that really is the question right there. You know, are we, you know, what kind of language? In other words, have we become, do we sort of, as Brother Tariq said, do we sit by or do we sit down in a very passive way when people use racist language? You know, the most notorious example of that being when some Arabic-speaking people use the term abid to refer to Black people, right? You know, that we need to have campaigns in our community to actually address these things, because this idea that we can just kind of sit down and sweep this under the carpet, because I do think to connect this to the larger issue, that if we're going to heal collectively as a community, if we're going to foster these opportunities and spaces of healing for our African American brothers and sisters, if we're going to be able to very sort of with credibility go out to the larger society and say, this is a problem, this has to stop, right? We have to be able to kind of address what's happening internally with us as a community. I mean, I'm an educator, and I really feel that every Muslim school needs to have as part of its curriculum, looking at African American history and African American Muslim history, not just in February, right? But this is something we need to be thinking about year round, so that we don't have, because it starts really, I think, at the level of the children. We don't need to have a single case, say in an Islamic school, where African American or Black children are reporting that they feel that they're being looked down upon, say by their peers, for example. People are using inappropriate language. I mean, if that's happening in those spaces, how can we again go out to the larger society with any amount of credibility?
So as somebody who's just jumped out of their 20s, and has all children under 6 years old, what I realized that a lot of our foremothers and forefathers were attempting to do when they were building institutions, trying to make community centers, trying to keep our children active under the umbrella of Islam and of this beautiful religion that they either already had or accepted, was that they were trying with their heart of hearts to build better Muslims. And so, as Imam Dawud alluded to earlier, is that, you know, our society, our Muslim community is built brick by brick, like Muslim brick by Muslim brick. And that means that we are instilling like principles and values. I'm sounding like my father right now, but we're instilling principles and values that express themselves at the point of attack, when the point of things are in conflict. And I'm reminded of Bilal ibn Rabah radiallahu anhu and his confrontation with Abu Dhar radiallahu anhu, when Abu Dhar calls him a son of a black woman. Oh, you son of a black woman. And so that is sort of like the climax of that conflict. But then he tries to restore it by saying, hey, you step on my face. And so it's not so much about the step on my face, but he was that much of a Muslim and that much of a human, because he erred, he made a mistake, we're human, but he was that much of a Muslim and a Muhsin that he was willing to say, I want to make this right. He was willing to be able to look internally and say, hey, I want to make this right. And I think that literally comes from us being able to instill those values and communicate those values as best we can within the work that, you know, we may be siloed into doing. And without that, I think it's very difficult to leap into these overarching goals that even myself, I even thought about, you know, at a younger time. And I'm realizing like no, we just need some really good Muslim folk and who, you know, who are able to introspect. And so I know you spoke about just art. For me, my goal, and inshallah, you know, hopefully I accomplish it when I'm dead and gone, is to cause Muslims to go back to this introspection that we were given through this religion, to reflect on our lot in life, and to understand that, like, we got to be careful what we do, how we say, how we interact with the people of La ilaha illallah, so that we aren't just walking through the world harming the people of La ilaha illallah and going about our day. So for me, I think about that more so than anything.
Alhamdulillah. Would anyone else like to respond? If not, I'd like to talk for a moment about COVID. Unfortunately, that's all we hear in the news. And for centuries, Black and Latino communities have unjustly borne the brunt of structural racism. And we see this manifesting during the corona pandemic in the form of the racial disparities in the number of cases and deaths across the country. In Michigan, Brother Dawud, where you are located, African Americans, from what I've seen or researched, will account for only 14% of the state's population, but represent 32% of the confirmed cases and 41% of the deaths. Caucasians, who make up the largest segment of that population, account for about 35% of the cases. In Maryland, in Maryland where I live, African Americans, who are only about 30% of the state population, account for 53% of the COVID reported deaths, while whites, who represent 60% of Maryland's population, accounts for, I guess, roughly about 38% of the COVID deaths. Moreover, according to NPR reports, there is a disproportionate amount of testing resources going to the areas and groups who are the least affected by COVID. So I'm going to just throw that out there and say, what are your takeaways from these numbers?
Those numbers are very American, just like mass incarceration and all sorts of other systemic disparities where Blacks and African Americans, as well as I would also say First Nation people or Indigenous Americans, the true Indigenous Americans, are always the least served in our society historically. And then there's like a de facto social hierarchy that's invisible, right? So you have African Americans and Native Americans at the bottom, then you can have Latinos, and then you can have some other groups, and then the white folks are at the top. But outside of that, I like to focus on something else relating to your question, and this is really the collective trauma and the psyche of Black people, and not believing what the government says or what news says, and how this influences behavior. Because if you're a Black person in Detroit, and I'm a Black person in Detroit, and Detroit is America's blackest major city. It's like an 80% Black city, right? I mean, this is the real chocolate city, not DC anymore. DC is white chocolate, gentrified. So when we have relatives or know people, or at least have heard about people who were victims of the Tuskegee experiment, where the government intentionally shot Black men with syphilis and then tracked Black men for decades to see what health effects it would do to them and their family. When you see higher rates of autism in African-American community, and it can be linked specifically to testing certain types of vaccines on Black folks, right? When we look at certain things, and these aren't wild conspiracy theories. Some conspiracies are actually real. They're real conspiracies, right? So when we know about these things in our community, then it's easier for other conspiracy theories to creep into the community and for people to distrust the government, because, see, this is the same government that put crack cocaine in our community. Mm. This is no conspiracy. This is real, right? With the help of the CIA and Bush. This is the community before that intentionally tried to destabilize the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement by intentionally putting heroin in Black communities. These are the same people that gave us bad vaccines, the same people that injected us with syphilis. So many people say, well, I'm not going to believe what they're saying about this particular situation. This is a way of controlling me or trying to perhaps prep me to test a new vaccine that's going to be involved in population control. So this is why a lot of people in Detroit are like, they're not social distancing, or at least they weren't in the very beginning, which led to much higher rates, because people were like, they're not going to trust what the governor says, even if she is a Democrat. They're not going to trust what these people are saying in corporate media. And this is the other shade that is the twin, I believe. You have the systemic racism in overt sense, but then it has how it's affected our perception and how we view information that comes to us as Black folks, especially when it comes from white-led institutions.
All right, would anyone else like to respond? Okay.
I can segue into I think the final question. We have time for just one more question. So when it comes to injustices, a lot of people confuse patience with passivity and complicity. And in Islam, obviously, Muslims are taught to have sabr when it comes to trials and tribulations. But there are some people who would argue that that's a justification for them to be complicit. How do you distinguish between these qualities, and what is your message to those who would leverage that as an excuse for inaction?
And can I say, can you also distinguish between patience and sabr, the difference?
Thank you so much, Sister Islaah and Sister Zainab. Let me reiterate that that by suggesting that racism, that we have to look at racism in terms of the spiritual pathology that it is, I'm not suggesting that, or from a theological lens, I'm not suggesting that it means that we don't address economic and political and social and cultural factors as well. We have to look at all of those things. You know, for the individuals who committed this crime against Ahmed Arbery, subhanAllah, you know, ultimately, and I know this is difficult, right? I know that this, I don't want anyone in the audience to misunderstand, but ultimately, we as Muslims, we have to understand that when people commit that type of act of oppression or dhulm, that we do have a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And of course, this advice was directed more towards Muslims, in that he told the companions that you have to aid your fellow Muslim, whether that person is oppressed or or is an oppressor. And of course, they understood the idea of aiding the oppressed. But then their question was, how do we, what does it mean to aid that person that's an oppressor? So the Prophet elaborated, peace and blessings be upon him, it's by preventing that person, by taking action so that person desists from their oppression. So as much as there are the measures we should take in terms of supplicating to Allah Ta'ala, as Brother Tariq mentioned, sitting and making dhikr, and of course making sure that we are fortifying ourselves spiritually. But we also have to ask ourselves, right, what steps are we actually taking so that those people that are committing those acts of oppression, that we are joining an effort so that it becomes a lot more difficult for them to do these things. I think that part of the problem is, again, the fact that everybody has access to guns in the society. And this, again, this uniquely American gun culture, that these people that committed this crime, that these criminals, that their first response, right, when they perceived that somebody had that the young man had trespassed or whatever they were alleging, that their automatic response was to go and grab their guns like some ridiculous vigilantes in the wild west. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous that was their go-to, to grab their guns and go after somebody with guns blazing. So, you know, as Muslims, I want to see us to have more of a voice in the movement, to bring some kind of regulation to address issues of gun control. So when we talk about having sabr, part of it, of course, or patience, part of it, of course, is making dua and trusting that we take the steps, and the outcomes are always with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But as people who've written about patience, people like Ibn al-Qayyim and al-Jawziyah and others, when they write about patience, even if you look at what they say about the linguistic understanding of patience, it actually involves taking some kind of action. Part of the definition of sabr in the Arabic language is that it actually involves being able to restrain somebody from committing an act of violence or oppression. That's part of sabr.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair. Imam Dawud or Brother Tariq, did you want to add anything to that?
I would just say, and add on what Ustadha Zaynab said, may Allah preserve her and reward her, that Imam Ash-Shafi'i, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, said that if people just deeply contemplated, had to tafakkur over one chapter of the Quran, it would suffice to guide them. And that is Surah Al-Asr. And if you look at the sequence, there's 4 things that Allah Azza wa Jal mentions about the human being who's not losing or not decreasing in their blessing that they've been given. And that is those who believe, work righteous deeds, and in a mutual enjoying of truth. So that's an action, and that's part of enjoining what is good and forbidding the evil. And then also it has and enjoining with each other sabr, right? So just going on to what she's saying, that sabr in itself is not something that's passive, it's something that's active, right? And this is what we're going through. Like, sabr doesn't mean just sitting still and just taking it, you know, it's just taking one for the team, right? Which some people perhaps maybe misunderstand that, but just read through and contemplate Surat al-Asr, and that's, and that in of itself, as Imam Shafi'i says, that is enough to answer the question.
Alhamdulillah. I think with that, and because of the time, we like to wrap up. But first, I want to thank all of you, you know, all of the panelists, Imam Dawud, Brother Tariq, Ustadha Zainab, and I want to thank my beloved co-host, Ustadha, I'm sorry, Sister Zainab. Well, we can call you Ustadha too.
I don't deserve that title yet.
No. Okay. And alhamdulillah, what I'd like for us to do, Imam Dawud, if you could close us out with a dua, please.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق الناصر بالحق بالحق وهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره مقدار العظيم ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم ربنا تقبل صيامنا وقيامنا وركوعنا وسجودنا ربنا تقبل دعاء يا الله يا أرحم الراحمين يا ذا الجلال والإكرام Ya Allah, Ya Hafiz, we ask you, Ya Hafiz, to protect our families and protect our loved ones, Ya Hafiz. Ya Hafiz, Ya Hafiz, Ya Hafiz, Ya Shafi, Ya Kafi, Ya Shafi, Ya Kafi, Ya Wali al-Afiyah, Nas'aluka al-Afwa wa Afiyata fi ad-dini wa ad-dunya wa al-akhirah bi rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. And we ask you, Ya Allah, to accept those who have passed amongst us from the COVID-19 virus, to accept them as shuhada, Ya Allah. And we ask you, Ya Allah, to give shifa to all of the sick believing men and believing women, no matter where they're at, and to give shifa and to give healing to all of those who have coronavirus, be they amongst the believers or amongst the disbelievers. Ya Allah, Ya Arhamar Rahimin, Ya Arhamar Rahimin, Ya Arhamar Rahimin. We ask you, Ya Allah, to take out and to help remove the fear and the ignorance out of the heart of people who are plagued with the disease of racism. Ya Arhamar Rahimin, Ya Arhamar Rahimin, Ya Arhamar Rahimin. And we ask you, Ya Allah, that us who have suffered racism, that we ourselves don't become dhalimeen and exceed the limits, exceed the boundaries, and do harm for people due to the harm that we have received. Ya Arhamar Rahimin, Ya Arhamar Rahimin, Ya Arhamar Rahimin. We ask you, Ya Allah, to bless our teachers, Ya Allah, and to forgive all of our teachers that have passed away from us, Ya Allah. Our teachers that are in Sham, our teachers that are in Senegal and Mali and in all of the places, and right here in America, Ya Allah. Forgive them, Ya Allah. Forgive them, Ya Allah. Resurrect them, Ya Allah, and have them be with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Allahumma rzuqna shafa'ata Muhammadin sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, wa la tahrimna suhbata innaka anta arhamar rahimin. Subhana rabbika bil izzati amma yasifun, والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. الفاتحة.
Ameen Ya Rab.
Ameen.
Jazakallah khair, Imam Dawud, for that beautiful, beautiful dua. And Jazakallah khair again to our panelists for taking time out of your busy Ramadan to grace us with your presence, to talk about these topics. And I know an hour is not nearly enough to pick at the surface and to delve deeper, but inshallah, this will be the first of many more conversations as we talk about these uncomfortable topics. So Ustadha Zainab, as you had mentioned earlier, talking about the elephant in the room, talking about these topics and not ignoring them and not pretending that they don't exist within our communities. And may Allah continue to enable us to really provide these spaces where our communities can inshallah benefit. So please keep us in your du'as for the rest of Ramadan. You guys are all in our du'as, and jazakumullah khair again.
Take care, everyone.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.